So we've looked at area between curves, we've looked at all of our integration techniques, and today we're going to start looking at some applications. So the first application that we're going to do is consumer producer surplus, and really we're going to start off with sort of an introduction to supply curves, to demand curves, and also to equilibrium points. Okay, what happens with market equilibrium? So first off, let's take a look at a situation, and it's a little bit silly, but it's somewhat relevant right now. Let's suppose that we're looking at the supply and the demand of toilet paper. So the first thing is that here we're going to be graphing the demand curve for toilet paper. On the one axis, the vertical axis, we're going to have the price per roll, and on the horizontal axis, we're going to have the quantity, and this is going to be the quantity in thousands. Okay. So first off, let's take a look at a couple different situations. So one, if the price is very high, okay, so if we're looking at a price of $2.50 per roll, then you would imagine that the quantity that people are willing to demand is going to be very low. Okay, so let's suppose that if the price is at $2.50, then the demand would be right here. The demand would be maybe 500 rolls of toilet paper. And then now let's look sort of at the other extreme. What if the price is very low? So what if we're looking at 50 cents a roll? Then the demand would be very high. So we would have something maybe like this, where if we have a demand of 50 cents, if we have a price of 50 cents, then the demand would be maybe 6,000 rolls. So if you consider this situation, okay, then as the price comes down, the quantity is going to be increasing in demand. So what you end up with from left to right is going to be a decreasing curve. Okay, so if I join these 2 points, I'm not going to use a straight line, but maybe it's going to be something like this, and we can call this our demand curve. Now let's take a look at another situation. Let's look at the supply curve. Okay, so the supply curve is going to be essentially the opposite of this. In other words, if the price is very high, then we know that people are going to want to produce this. Okay, they're going to want to produce as much as possible if they know they can get $2.50 per roll. So if the price is high, then similarly the quantity produced is also going to be high. So maybe we end up having something like this, where if, let's do it right here. If the price is $2.50, maybe we have 5,500 rolls of toilet paper being made. Okay, and then down on the other extreme, if the price is very low, if it's 50 cents per roll, then very few people are going to want to make toilet paper knowing that they can't get a good price for it. So let's suppose that maybe only 1,000 rolls will be made and supplied if the price is low. And then from left to right, we're going to have that as the price increases, okay, so does the quantity, and so what we're going to get is an increasing function joining these 2 points. So again, let's suppose that we have something like this. Okay, so on the one hand we have our demand curve. Now what we're looking at right here, this is going to be our supply curve. Okay, so let's clean this up a little bit, and we're going to take a look at what happens in a particular situation. Okay, so let's suppose that we end up having a sales price of maybe 75 cents. So if I look here at 75 cents, this would be the intersection of 75 cents with our supply curve and our demand curve. So what this means then is that if the price is 75 cents, let's take a look at the demand. So the demand over here would be 4,500 rolls. That's a very good price. So we would end up with the demand being 4,500 rolls. Fine. What would be the supply though? Okay, if we look over here on the supply curve, at 75 cents, the supply would only be 2,000 rolls. And so right away you notice that there's going to be a shortage. Okay, there's going to be a shortage in this case of 2,500 rolls. And as a market, that's not ideal. Okay, what would happen in a situation like this? As soon as the companies producing the toilet paper realize that there is a shortage, okay, the price is going to go up as people sort of compete to end up purchasing it. So you're going to get that these points here and here, okay, are going to go up along the curve. Okay, as the price goes up, more companies will be willing to produce it, and as here the price goes up, fewer people will be willing to purchase it. Okay, so that's what happens in the scenario where you would have a shortage. Let's take a look at another price point. Okay, so let's go up here, maybe to around $1.50. So what happens if we're willing to do $1.50? That's going to be our setup. And so now we're going to have a slightly different situation. So at a price of $1.50, what's going to be our demand? So let's look here on the demand curve. Well, it looks roughly like 1,500 maybe. Okay, it looks like this is where our demand, or sorry, where our demand would be, yeah. So we have 1,500 rolls. And let's take a look at the supply. At $1.50, this right here would be our supply. Maybe that's 4,250, maybe somewhere around here. So that's going to be 4,250 rolls. And what does this mean? Well, it means that our supply is going to exceed the demand. There's going to be what's called a surplus. And in this case, there's be a surplus of 2,750 rolls. And so in a situation where you're running a surplus, what would happen to the price? What would happen to the quantity? Well, if you have a surplus, people are going to be less willing to purchase it, okay, and people are going to be less willing to buy it. So let's look at here what would happen if the price comes down. Okay, well, it's going to come down here along the curve, and so again, as the price comes down, more people will be willing to purchase it, but as the price comes down over here, fewer people are going to be willing to supply it. Okay, so you can sort of see what's happening here. As this keeps happening, okay, over time, the price is going to approach this one natural point right here. It's going to be approaching the intersection of the supply and the demand curves. And there's a name for this. So here, if we look at that, this point right here is called market equilibrium. So for this made up situation, what we have is going to be our equilibrium price and our equilibrium price, looking at this point right here in the middle, is going to be roughly maybe $1 and let's say 20 cents. And let's look at the equilibrium quantity. How much will be produced, how much will be demanded at this price point. And if we look at that, let's suppose that maybe it's 2,800. Our equilibrium quantity would be 2,800, and again we're looking at rolls. Okay, so this is going to be our introduction to market equilibrium and to the supply curve and to the demand curve. What we're going to do next is I'm just going to define these terms, okay, and then we'll look at doing some examples. Okay, so now let's be a little bit more formal, talking about supply and demand. So first off, looking at demand, we know our demand curve, as we saw in the last one in our example for toilet paper. If we graph it here with respect to price and quantity, from left to right, the demand curve is going to be decreasing. Okay, in other words, as the price increases, the demand will be smaller, and as the price comes down, the quantity is going to be increasing demand. Okay, so the way that we're going to be representing our demand curve is going to be d of q, okay, and it's relating here our variable price and our variable quantity to each other, and it's going to represent the quantity of units q that consumers are willing to buy at a certain price of p dollars. Okay, that's our demand curve. When we look at the other side, we look at the supply curve, and our supply curve is going to be represented as S of Q, and it's going to relate again the price to the amount that is actually willing to be supplied by the companies. And so here we're going to look at the quantity that producers will sell at a given price p dollars, and typically when you're looking at your supply curve, from left to right, your supply curve is going to be increasing, because naturally as the price goes up, the amount that people are willing to produce and sell at that price is going to be increasing. Okay, so those are those two concepts, okay, in our definitions for demand and supply curves. Now let's take a look at the equilibrium point that we saw in the first example. So here we have our definition for equilibrium point. Okay, we saw in the last example that if we are looking at a price point below the equilibrium point, then we're going to be looking at a shortage. Okay, but if we end up with a price point that is above the equilibrium point, we're going to be looking at a surplus, and in all the cases the price is going to begin to move towards the equilibrium point. And so really right here at the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve, this is going to be the equilibrium point. That's when supply matches up with demand, and really to find that point you're going to be solving this equation, solve for when those two functions intersect, and that point is going to be represented by coordinate here q naught p naught, or q0 p0, where q0, this right here is the equilibrium quantity, and this right here is the equilibrium price. Okay, so those are going to be what we are very interested in. Okay, and often in markets you're going to want to find that equilibrium point, okay, because that's essentially the point where both the suppliers and the consumers are content with the price point. Okay, and ideally all of the quantity that is being produced is also being consumed. So let's take all of this and we're going to go work on an example. So here we have an example with demand and supply equations given by D of Q and S of Q, and we would like to find both the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. So first off, we're going to have to start by finding the equilibrium quantity, and that's going to be achieved by setting these two functions equal to each other, finding the intersection. So here what we're going to do is we're going to solve when is D of Q equal to S of Q, which on the left hand side gives us 8,000 over Q plus 5 equal to Q plus 5 all squared. And really to solve for Q here, we're just going to take Q plus 5, multiply it onto both sides, and what we end up getting is 8,000 equal to q plus 5 all to the power of 3. And so now what we're going to do is take the cubed root of both sides. And on the left-hand side, we have the cubed root of 8,000 is going to be equal to q plus 5. The cubed root of 8,000 is going to give us 20. And so 20 is equal to q plus 5, which means really that q is going to be equal to 15. Okay, and so for us, that's going to be 15 units. That is our equilibrium quantity. All right. Now that we have our equilibrium quantity, we also need to find here the equilibrium price. And we can do that one of two different ways. Okay, really we could plug in our value of q into the supply function or plug it into the demand function, but it doesn't matter which we do because this is the intersection of both of those curves, so the price will be the same for either one. So here, let's just use whichever one is easier. Maybe that'll be here the supply function. So now we want to find P naught, okay, the equilibrium price, using the fact that here we have Q naught, our equilibrium quantity is 15, and we're going to use S of Q. So here, what is going to be S of 15? We plug it in, we get 15 plus 5 squared. That's going to give us 20 squared. That's going to be 400, and so that is going to be our equilibrium price. It's going to be $400. And so now we have both the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And actually, let's do one more thing here together. Let's go sort of picture what this looks like by looking at the graph. So here's what we have. We have left to right our demand function decreasing. We also have here our supply function left to right increasing, and the intersection point between the two is our equilibrium point happening with 15 units and an equilibrium price of $400. So every time you're thinking about equilibrium price, you are thinking about the intersection of these two curves, the intersection of the demand curve with the supply curve.